Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the population explosion in Africa, and we have to talk about the increased population in Africa, Dr. Leonard Madu. And Dr. Madu is no stranger to any members of our audience. He's been with us on many, many occasions, and I think that the information that you have to give us today, Dr. Madu, is some surprising kind of information, because when we talk about the population explosion in Africa, we're also reminded that Africa also has had all kinds of famine, all kinds of destruction, all kinds of things that in a real sense killed a lot of folks, but yet still we are now saying that there is a population explosion. Let's talk about that, Dr. Madu.
Thank you. Well, that's a topic, a lot of people either do not want to talk about or they don't understand. If we have to go back, in 1850, the population of Africa was about 110 million people. In 1950, 100 years later, the population of Africa was about 241 million people. Today, about 60 years later, the population of Africa is about 1.5 billion people.
Billion of people on the continent of Africa?
Yeah, 1.5 billion.
1.5 billion people on the continent of Africa.
Exactly. In 1950, it was 241 million. Today, 1.5 billion people on the continent. And then if the trans-Saharan slave trade or the transatlantic slave trade had not happened, you know exactly, the population might have been more. Think about it. So now you have 1.5 billion people on the continent, in an area of land 11.7 million square miles. The continent of Africa is 11.7 million square miles. That's about 3 times the size of the United States. It's the second largest continent, after Asia. The population of Asia today is about 4.2 billion people. Asia has about 50% of the people in this world. China and India alone has about 37% of the people in this world. With the current population Africa has, Africa has about 15% of the world's population and about 20% of this land area, land area. Now look at some of the countries, their populations. And when I talk about the countries in Africa, I include also the dependencies. What I mean, even though about 54 countries already have independence, there are other territories in Africa controlled by the French. You have to count all those numbers too, like the Canary Islands and you name it, Mayotte and all the rest. In West Africa, Nigeria is the largest, the most populous, of course, in the whole continent anyway. But in West Africa, Nigeria has about 160 million people. In 1960, when Nigeria became independent, it had 55 million people in 1960. Today it has 160. Ghana has 25 million people. Ivory Coast, 20 million people. You go to East Africa, Ethiopia has about 85 million people. Tanzania has 41 million people. Uganda has about 32 million people. Kenya has about 39 million people. You go to Southern Africa, South Africa has about 49 million people. Zimbabwe about 15 million people. In North Africa, Egypt has about 85 million people. Algeria has about 49 million people. Morocco has about 34 million people. And Ethiopia has about 85 million people. Now you have the extremes, high populations like Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt. Then you have those that have very few, people in the countries. For example, the Seychelles has less than 100,000 people. It's a country. Equatorial Guinea has about 600 or 700,000 people. The Comoro Islands has about 500,000 people. But then you put all these countries together, the total population is about 1.5 billion people today. Now, the United Nations development program, the current information they have, says that in 2050, out of the 20 countries in this world, 7 of the largest countries will be from Africa in terms of population.
Okay, Dr. Madu, let's end this first segment with those statements, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.